On the evening of October 23, 1876, Boston's most exclusive charity gala was interrupted by a discovery that would send shockwaves through New England's financial elite for decades to come. The grand ballroom of the Parker House Hotel filled with the region's most powerful railroad barons, banking magnates, and political leaders, fell silent when a blood-stained opera glove was found abandoned on the marble steps leading to the hotel's private garden. The glove belonged to Margaret Ashworth, wife of prominent banker Harrison Ashworth, who had simply vanished into the crisp October night, leaving behind only this single piece of evidence and a mystery that authorities would spend the next 30 years trying to solve. What they would discover in their investigation would expose a conspiracy so vast and so damaging that 4 of Boston's most prominent families would pay enormous sums to have the police records permanently sealed. Before we dive deeper into Margaret's story and the web of financial corruption that led to her disappearance, I want you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because stories like this one, stories they desperately tried to bury, are exactly what we uncover here. And leave a comment telling me what state you're listening from, because Margaret's story connects to a financial conspiracy that reached into every major city in America. But to understand why Margaret Ashworth's disappearance terrified Boston's banking establishment, we must first journey back to the world she inhabited. In 1876, Boston's financial district rivaled New York's Wall Street as the center of American capitalism. The city's street banks controlled vast railroad empires, funded Western expansion, and managed the investments of European nobility seeking American opportunities. At the heart of this financial machinery stood Harrison Ashworth, whose Commonwealth Trust Company had become one of New England's most powerful banking institutions. Margaret Catherine Morrison had married Harrison Ashworth in 1868, a union that combined old Boston Brahmin bloodlines with new industrial wealth. Margaret's father, shipping magnate Cornelius Morrison, had built his fortune in the China trade, while her mother claimed descent from one of the original Puritan families that had founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony. This pedigree, combined with Margaret's remarkable intelligence and social grace, made her the perfect partner for an ambitious banker seeking to establish himself among Boston's elite. Harrison Ashworth's rise had been meteoric and carefully calculated. Born into comfortable but not wealthy circumstances, he had worked his way through Harvard College and immediately entered the banking business as a junior clerk. His mathematical brilliance and understanding of railroad financing had caught the attention of established bankers, and by 1870, he had accumulated enough capital and connections to establish Commonwealth Trust. The bank specialized in railroad investments, particularly the financing of Western expansion projects that promised enormous returns for those bold enough to invest. Margaret had proven to be far more than a decorative society wife. She possessed a keen understanding of finance that often surprised her husband's business associates, and she took an active interest in the bank's operations. Their Beacon Hill mansion became a gathering place where railroad executives, government officials, and foreign investors met to arrange deals worth millions of dollars. Margaret's dinner parties were legendary, elaborate affairs where senators mingled with European financiers, and business agreements that would shape the American economy were negotiated over champagne and oysters. The Boston Globe Society pages couldn't get enough of the Ashworths. Margaret's fashion choices were copied by women throughout New England. Her charitable endeavors were praised in editorial columns, and her political opinions were sought by prominent politicians. She had personally raised funds for the construction of Boston's first public library and had established a foundation that provided education for the daughters of working-class families. Her influence extended far beyond social gatherings. Railroad presidents consulted her about route planning, and even Governor William Gaston had sought her advice on financial legislation. But beneath the glittering surface of Margaret's carefully orchestrated life, dangerous currents were already beginning to flow. The railroad boom that had made fortunes for investors like Harrison was built on financial practices that operated in legal gray areas and sometimes crossed into outright fraud. The pressure to deliver ever higher returns to investors had led many banks to engage in stock manipulation, false accounting, and the kind of reckless speculation that would eventually trigger economic disasters. Margaret first became aware of potential problems with her husband's business practices in the summer of 1875. She had been reviewing household accounts when she noticed discrepancies in the bank's quarterly statements that Harrison brought home for her review. Certain railroad investments that should have shown consistent returns were displaying erratic patterns that suggested either gross mismanagement or deliberate manipulation. Her initial inquiries to Harrison were met with reassurances that the irregularities were merely temporary adjustments related to track construction delays and seasonal shipping variations. But Margaret's mathematical mind, sharpened by years of managing complex social events and charitable fundraising campaigns, detected patterns that suggested something more sinister. Railroad stocks that Commonwealth Trust was heavily promoting to investors were being simultaneously sold by the bank's officers, including Harrison himself. The discovery that would ultimately seal Margaret's fate came in September 1876, just weeks before her disappearance. While reviewing documents in Harrison's home study, she discovered correspondence between her husband and James Mitchell, president of the Western and Atlantic Railroad Company. The letters revealed a systematic scheme to manipulate railroad stock prices through false reports of track progress, fabricated shipping contracts, and coordinated buying and selling designed to create artificial market conditions. The conspiracy was breathtaking in its scope and devastating in its implications. Commonwealth Trust, along with 3 other major Boston banks, had been selling worthless railroad securities to investors while using insider information to profit from the inevitable collapse of these same investments. Pension funds, church endowments, and the savings of thousands of middle-class families had been systematically looted to enrich a small group of banking executives and railroad officials. But the most shocking aspect of the scheme was its target. The conspirators had specifically focused on selling fraudulent securities to recent immigrants, widows, and other vulnerable investors who lacked the financial sophistication to detect the fraud. Margaret discovered records showing that her own husband had personally sold over $2 million worth of worthless railroad bonds to Irish immigrants who had trusted him with their life savings. Margaret's initial reaction was denial, then anger, and finally a cold determination to expose the truth. She began secretly copying documents from Harrison's files, photographing correspondence, and creating a detailed record of the conspiracy. Her plan was to present the evidence to federal authorities and to ensure that the victims of the fraud received restitution from the enormous profits that the conspirators had accumulated. But Margaret had underestimated the sophisticated surveillance network that protected Boston's financial elite. By early October 1876, Harrison had become aware that his wife was investigating his business affairs. Bank security personnel, hired from the same Pinkerton detective agency that would later be involved in similar conspiracies, had been monitoring Margaret's activities and reporting her movements to Harrison. The confrontation between Margaret and Harrison took place on October 15, 1876, in the library of their Beacon Hill mansion. According to testimony later provided by household staff, the conversation began calmly but quickly escalated into a heated argument that could be heard throughout the house. Harrison initially attempted to justify the fraud as standard business practice, arguing that all banks engaged in similar activities and that their investors had been willing participants who understood the risks. Margaret's response was uncompromising. She informed Harrison that she had compiled comprehensive evidence of the conspiracy and intended to present it to federal investigators within the week. She had also prepared detailed financial calculations showing how much money needed to be returned to defrauded investors, and she demanded that Harrison begin making restitution immediately. Harrison's reaction revealed the true extent of the danger that Margaret faced. Rather than expressing remorse or agreeing to her demands, he informed her that the conspiracy involved not just Commonwealth Trust, but virtually every major financial institution in Boston. The exposure of the fraud would trigger a financial panic that would destroy the city's economy and ruin thousands of innocent people who had invested legitimately in railroad development. More ominously, Harrison revealed that the conspiracy enjoyed protection from the highest levels of government. Senator Charles Sumner was aware of the stock manipulation scheme and received substantial payments in exchange for his silence. Governor Gaston had invested his own money in the fraudulent securities and would face bankruptcy if the truth became public. Even federal banking regulators had been compromised through bribes and investment opportunities. Margaret's threat to expose the conspiracy was not merely an attack on her husband's business interests. It was a challenge to an entire network of corruption that reached into every level of Massachusetts government and finance. The stakes were too high and the potential losses too catastrophic for the conspirators to allow her to proceed. The charity gala on October 23, 1876, had been planned months in advance as a fundraising event for the Boston Children's Hospital. Margaret had been instrumental in organizing the affair, securing donations from wealthy patrons and coordinating with the Parker House Hotel for the elaborate dinner and entertainment. The guest list read like a directory of New England's most powerful families, railroad presidents, banking executives, political leaders, and European investors who had come to Boston seeking American opportunities. Margaret arrived at the Parker House that evening wearing an elegant gown of deep burgundy silk, accessorized with diamond jewelry that had belonged to her grandmother. Witnesses later described her as appearing unusually tense, though she performed her social obligations with characteristic grace and intelligence. She moved through the crowded ballroom, greeting guests, coordinating with the hotel staff, and ensuring that the evening's fundraising goals were met. But several observers noted that Margaret seemed to be paying particular attention to specific guests, engaging in intense conversations with individuals who were not part of her usual social circle. Hotel staff later recalled that she had requested a private meeting room and had spent approximately 30 minutes in conference with two gentlemen whom they could not identify. The last confirmed sighting of Margaret Ashworth occurred at approximately 10:15 p.m. She had been seen near the hotel's private garden entrance, apparently engaged in conversation with a man whom witnesses described as well-dressed but unfamiliar. The man appeared to be showing Margaret some kind of document, and their conversation seemed urgent and serious. When Margaret failed to return to the ballroom, her absence was initially attributed to her diligent attention to the evening's logistics. It was not unusual for her to spend time coordinating with hotel staff or resolving minor issues that arose during large social events. But as the evening progressed and Margaret remained absent, concern began to grow among the guests who knew her well. The discovery of the bloodstained opera glove on the marble steps leading to the hotel's garden sent immediate shockwaves through the assembled guests. The glove was unmistakably Margaret's. Witnesses had admired its distinctive pearl buttons and delicate lace trim earlier in the evening. But the dark stains on the white silk were clearly blood, and the glove's location suggested that something violent had occurred. Harrison Ashworth's reaction to his wife's disappearance was immediate and traumatic. He organized search parties, contacted the police, and offered a substantial reward for information leading to Margaret's safe return. His public displays of concern and grief seemed genuine, and many observers praised him for his devotion to his missing wife. But the investigation that followed would reveal a very different picture of the events surrounding Margaret's disappearance. The Boston Police Department assigned their most experienced detective, Captain Michael O'Sullivan, to lead the investigation into Margaret's disappearance. O'Sullivan, an Irish immigrant who had risen through the ranks through intelligence and determination, approached the case with the kind of methodical thoroughness that would define professional police work for the next century. The first phase of O'Sullivan's investigation focused on Margaret's activities during the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Interviews with household staff, bank employees, and social acquaintances revealed a picture of a woman who had been under increasing stress and who had been asking unusual questions about her husband's business affairs. The Ashworth family's head butler, William Chun, provided crucial testimony about the tensions he had observed between Margaret and Harrison during the month before her disappearance. According to Chun, the couple had engaged in several heated arguments in Harrison's study, often continuing late into the night. Margaret had also been spending unusual amounts of time reviewing bank documents and had made several trips to the Commonwealth Trust offices during hours when the bank was normally closed. More significantly, Chun reported that Margaret had been visited several times by a gentleman she introduced as Mr. Thomas Bradford, claiming he was a journalist writing about women's roles in charitable organizations. But Chun had overheard portions of their conversations that suggested Bradford was actually questioning Margaret about her husband's business practices and the operations of Commonwealth Trust. O'Sullivan's investigation of Thomas Bradford revealed that no journalist by that name worked for any Boston newspaper, and none of the city's charitable organizations had any record of cooperating with such a story. The description provided by the Ashworth household staff matched that of a man who had been asking questions about railroad investments at several other banks throughout the city. The breakthrough in O'Sullivan's investigation came when he discovered that Margaret had been secretly meeting with federal banking investigators who were conducting a preliminary inquiry into irregularities in New England Railroad financing. The investigators, working under the direction of the Treasury Department, had been gathering evidence of stock manipulation and fraud involving several major Boston banks. Margaret had approached the federal investigators in early October, providing them with detailed documentation of the conspiracy she had discovered. Her evidence included correspondence between Harrison and railroad executives, financial records showing coordinated stock transactions, and accounting documents that revealed how investor money had been diverted to enrich bank officers. The federal investigators confirmed that Margaret's evidence was both comprehensive and devastating. Her documentation provided proof of criminal fraud involving millions of dollars and implicated some of the most prominent names in Boston finance and politics. The investigators had been planning to use Margaret's testimony as the foundation for criminal prosecutions that would have sent dozens of wealthy and powerful men to prison. But Margaret had never appeared for her scheduled testimony session on October 25th, 2 days after her disappearance from the charity gala. The federal investigators, concerned about her safety, had immediately contacted local authorities and demanded a thorough investigation into her disappearance. O'Sullivan's inquiry now focused on identifying the individuals who had been threatened by Margaret's cooperation with federal investigators. The list was extensive and terrifying in its implications. Harrison Ashworth faced not only criminal prosecution, but also civil lawsuits that would have bankrupted him and sent him to prison. For decades, Senator Charles Sumner would have been expelled from Congress and faced criminal charges for accepting bribes. Governor Gaston would have been impeached and prosecuted for corruption. But the investigation took a sinister turn when O'Sullivan attempted to interview some of the individuals implicated in Margaret's evidence. Several key witnesses suddenly became unavailable, claiming business travel or family emergencies that required their immediate departure from Boston. Others provided alibis that were so well coordinated that they suggested advanced planning and cooperation. Most disturbing was the pattern of obstruction that O'Sullivan encountered from within his own department. Evidence disappeared from police. Files, witness statements were mysteriously altered, and O'Sullivan found himself reassigned to other cases whenever he made significant progress in the Margaret Ashworth investigation. The breakthrough came when O'Sullivan discovered that several of the police department's senior officers had received substantial loans from Commonwealth Trust Company, loans that were issued at unusually favorable terms, and that created obvious conflicts of interest. The police investigation into Margaret's disappearance was being deliberately sabotaged by officers who were financially beholden to her husband. Working independently and often in secret, O'Sullivan compiled evidence that painted a horrifying picture of Margaret's final hours. The journalist who had been questioning her was actually a Pinkerton operative hired to monitor her activities and report on her cooperation with federal investigators. The two gentlemen she had met with at the Parker House were additional Pinkerton agents who had lured her to the private garden under the pretense of providing new information about the railroad conspiracy. Margaret had been murdered on the night of October 23, 1876, killed because her testimony would have exposed a financial conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government and business. Her body had been disposed of in a way designed to ensure that it would never be found, and the blood-stained glove had been left as a red herring to suggest that she had been the victim of a random crime rather than a calculated assassination. But O'Sullivan's investigation was cut short when he was found dead in his apartment on November 15, 1876. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but his landlady reported that he had been visited by two well-dressed gentlemen. On the evening he died, men who claimed to be conducting official police business. The investigation into Margaret Ashworth's disappearance was officially closed on December 1, 1876, with the case classified as an unsolved missing person matter. No arrests were made, no charges were filed, and the evidence that Margaret had compiled was never presented to federal prosecutors. The railroad stock manipulation conspiracy that Margaret had tried to expose continued for another 6 months, before finally collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. When the Western and Atlantic Railroad Company declared bankruptcy in June 1877, investors lost over $50 million, most of it belonging to the working-class immigrants and vulnerable individuals who had trusted Boston's banking establishment with their life savings. Harris and Ashworth avoided criminal prosecution by cooperating with federal investigators and providing testimony against his former associates in the conspiracy. His cooperation earned him immunity from prosecution, but it could not protect him from the financial ruin that followed the collapse of Commonwealth Trust Company. But the story of Margaret Ashworth's murder did not end with her disappearance, or the collapse of the conspiracy she had tried to expose. In the years that followed, a different kind of justice began to manifest itself in ways that suggested the dead woman's evidence had been entirely accurate, and that her sacrifice had not been entirely in vain. The men who had orchestrated Margaret's murder discovered that eliminating a witness had not eliminated the consequences of their crimes. The financial practices that she had threatened to expose proved to be the seeds of their own destruction, creating instabilities that eventually brought down the entire network of corruption they had built. James Mitchell, president of the Western and Atlantic Railroad and one of the key figures in the stock manipulation conspiracy, never recovered from the financial collapse that Margaret had predicted. His railroad empire crumbled when investors discovered the fraudulent nature of his securities, and he died in poverty in 1883, found frozen to death in a Chicago boarding house after spending his final years as a vagrant. Senator Charles Sumner's political career ended in disgrace when a separate corruption investigation uncovered evidence of his involvement in railroad fraud. Though he avoided criminal prosecution through political connections, he was censured by the Senate and died in 1874. Before Margaret's disappearance, But his involvement in similar schemes was later exposed through documents that Margaret had gathered. Harrison Ashworth's fate was perhaps the most poetic of all. Despite his cooperation with federal investigators, he found himself unemployable in Boston's financial community. His reputation destroyed and his fortune lost, he moved to California, where he attempted to rebuild his career in railroad development. But the economic instabilities that his own fraudulent practices had helped create followed him west. He died in 1889 in a San Francisco hospital, bankrupt and alone, having lost everything he had gained through his criminal activities. The Parker House Hotel, where Margaret had last been seen alive, became the subject of persistent rumors about supernatural occurrences. Hotel staff and guests reported seeing the figure of an elegantly dressed woman walking through the corridors late at night, often carrying what appeared to be documents or papers. The private garden where Margaret had met her killers became a place that employees avoided after dark, claiming that the scent of her distinctive French perfume lingered in the air even during winter months. Detective O'Sullivan's private files, discovered after his death, contained evidence that Margaret's murder was not an isolated crime, but part of a broader pattern of violence used by Boston's financial elite to eliminate threats to their interests. His notes referenced at least 3 other mysterious deaths of individuals who had attempted to expose financial fraud during the 1870 S-dot in 1895. Construction workers renovating the Parker House Hotel's basement discovered a sealed room that had apparently been walled up shortly after the hotel's construction. The room contained what appeared to be personal effects belonging to missing persons from the 1870s and 1880s, including a distinctive ruby bracelet that the Ashworth family confirmed had belonged to Margaret. The discovery suggested that Margaret's murder had been part of a systematic campaign of violence carried out by professional killers who used the hotel as a base of operations. The sealed room had apparently served as a temporary storage facility for evidence that needed to be disposed of carefully to avoid detection. The Massachusetts Historical Society acquired Margaret's papers in 1920 when Harrison's estate was finally settled. The documents included her secret correspondence with federal investigators, detailed financial analyses of the railroad conspiracy, and personal letters that revealed her growing awareness of the danger she faced. One letter, dated October 20th, 1876, just 3 days before her disappearance, was particularly haunting. Margaret had written to her sister in Philadelphia, explaining her decision to cooperate with federal investigators despite the risks involved. "I understand that my actions may bring consequences that extend far beyond my own safety," Margaret had written, "but I cannot remain silent while thousands of innocent families are being systematically robbed by men who have sworn to protect their interests. If something should happen to me, please ensure that the truth about these crimes is eventually revealed." The letter had never been mailed, suggesting that Margaret's movements were being monitored so closely that she was unable to communicate freely with her own family members. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a historian who spent 15 years researching the Margaret Ashworth case, published the definitive account of the conspiracy in 1976, exactly 100 years after Margaret's disappearance. Her book, The Boston Murders: Financial Fraud and Political Corruption in Gilded Age New England, revealed the full scope of the conspiracy and confirmed that Margaret's allegations had been entirely accurate. According to Dr. Morrison's research, Margaret Ashworth died because she threatened to expose a financial conspiracy that would have destroyed Boston's reputation as a center of honest commerce and sent dozens of prominent men to prison. Her murder was not a crime of passion, but a calculated business decision carried out by men who viewed human life as just another obstacle to be removed when it interfered with their profit margins. The Margaret Ashworth Foundation, established by her sister's family in 1900, quietly funded investigations into financial fraud and political corruption throughout New England. The foundation helped expose dozens of cases involving the systematic exploitation of vulnerable investors, and it provided legal assistance to victims of financial fraud who lacked the resources to seek justice independently. Perhaps the most enduring mystery surrounding Margaret's murder was the fate of additional evidence that she had apparently hidden before her death. Despite extensive searches of the Ashworth mansion and Commonwealth Trust offices, investigators never found all of the documentation that federal authorities believed she had compiled. Dr. Morrison's theory was that Margaret had deposited the most damaging evidence with a trusted third party, someone outside the financial community who would be able to preserve it safely until the appropriate time for revelation. She believed that Margaret had suspected the danger she faced and had taken steps to ensure that her work would survive her death. In 1994, renovations at the Boston Public Library uncovered a sealed envelope hidden behind a loose brick in the Huckpit building's original foundation. The envelope, marked with Margaret's initials and dated October 1876, contained what appeared to be the missing evidence: detailed financial records, correspondence between conspirators, and a complete list of investors who had been defrauded. The discovery of Margaret's final evidence, 118 years after her murder, provided conclusive proof of every allegation she had made. The documents revealed a conspiracy that had stolen over $100 million from investors and had corrupted every level of Massachusetts government. But by 1994, all of the original conspirators were long dead, and the statute of limitations had expired on their crimes. The Boston Public Library donated Margaret's evidence to the Massachusetts Historical Society, where it remains today as a part of a permanent exhibition on financial fraud and political corruption in American history. Visitors to the exhibition often report feeling a sense of sadness when viewing Margaret's final documents, as if her spirit remains present to ensure that her story is finally told in full. The private garden at the Parker House Hotel, where Margaret met her death, was eventually converted to a memorial garden dedicated to victims of financial crime. A small plaque, installed in 1976, reads, "In memory of those who gave their lives in the pursuit of justice and truth." Margaret Ashworth's story became a cautionary tale that was whispered about in Boston's financial district for decades. But many who studied the case believed that its importance extended far beyond the specific crimes that led to her death. Her murder represented a turning point in American history, when the country's financial elite demonstrated that they were willing to kill to protect their interests. The case continued to fascinate researchers and financial crime investigators well into the 21st century. In 2016, the FBI's white-collar crime unit announced that they were using modern analytical techniques to re-examine the patterns of financial fraud that Margaret had documented, looking for similar schemes in contemporary financial markets. For many who studied Margaret's story, the question of legal justice was less important than the broader lessons that her death provided about the dangers of unchecked financial power and the courage required to challenge entrenched corruption. Her murder became a symbol of the price that ordinary citizens sometimes pay when they attempt to hold powerful institutions accountable. This mystery shows us that financial crime is not a victimless offense, and that those who profit from fraud will go to extraordinary lengths to protect their schemes. Margaret Ashworth died because she refused to remain silent about crimes that were devastating innocent families, and her courage ultimately ensured that the truth would be revealed, even if justice was delayed by more than a century. What do you think of Margaret's story? Do you believe that all the conspirators involved in her murder have been identified, or are there still secrets buried in Boston's financial institutions? Margaret Ashworth's sacrifice ensured that one of America's largest financial conspiracies was eventually exposed, but it cost her everything. Leave your comment below telling me what you think really happened during Margaret's final meeting at the Parker House Hotel. If you enjoyed this tale of financial corruption and murder, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves historical mysteries about the dark side of American business. The truth about financial crime has a way of surfacing, even when powerful people try to bury it forever. See you in the next video.